just to introduce myself, my name is Katie Hill, and I'm really thrilled to have you here. I'm working with B-Lab Europe, and you probably know B-Lab is the not-for-profit that is rolling out the B Corp movement across Europe, and it's a global movement. And I'm really delighted I'm going to be in such good company today with Hester Janssens from Fairtrade in the Netherlands. I'm going to introduce her to you in a minute, but first I'm actually just going to give you a little bit of a scene set, if I may. We actually started these coffee and good company conversations earlier in the year, in June, as a way of just opening up conversations we really wanted to have in B-Lab and understand more about some of the incredible work that interesting people are doing through companies or through networks. And we realized actually it wasn't probably just us who were interested in these conversations, but they could be of interest to many of you. And I hope that's what you will find today will be. And really the thing we're most interested in digging into in these conversations is kind of what does it actually mean to run a company or to run a purpose-led organization that's designed to support those who contribute to the success of a business. So what we might call stakeholders. This term stakeholder governance is used an awful lot, and I think, and our impression is that it's not fully understood what it really means and what difference it can make to the way business functions and operates, and how it can really contribute to the key issues of our day, which are actually we know are hugely pressing. So this is really where our focus has been, and we've had a series of different conversations with people and to understand more about the key stakeholders in their businesses and how they work with them. And then underpinning this is a proposal that has come, which we are waiting for from the European Union, to look at what does sustainable governance really mean for businesses. And this is an extremely seminal proposal that we expect to have. It could change, really fundamentally change the way businesses operate, and it would make a real opportunity for the Green Deal, the ambitious Green Deal, to make the continent of Europe carbon neutral by 2050. This actually would be really essential. We have to have businesses behaving differently, mandatorily considering the impacts that they have on society and on the environment if we're going to reach that. So with COP just 2 weeks away, and this being absolutely the hottest topic really of the moment, it feels that the more we as participants and citizens can understand what's at stake here, we really can then contribute to the discussions that are going to be held across the European Union and are going on globally in different places. And to that end, we've actually established an interdependence coalition, and we'll put the link of that into the chat. But Fairtrade have been one of the early adopters of this whole focus on the stakeholder, and one of the key stakeholders for them obviously is the suppliers and producers of particular commodities, and so really understand exactly what's at stake and what difference it can make. And so this is why it's wonderful for me to have the chance to introduce you to Hester over a cup of coffee, and we're now going to touch on some of the things that Fairtrade have really focused on. And I suggest we start with, for those of you who've got coffee in your hand, understanding a little bit. Hester, big welcome to you. I hope your coffee's there. Lovely.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to hear you. And maybe we could just start with kind of how does this coffee, what's your role in getting this coffee, Fairtrade coffee, to our mugs, and how has that actually been part of the journey of Fairtrade in the first place?
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me this morning. It's really nice to have my morning coffee with you today and everyone listening in. So yeah, I think people often don't realize that behind our daily cup of coffee, there's a whole world and millions of people involved in this little cup. So that's also where Fairtrade comes from. It all started with coffee in the 1980s already. So it's over 30 years ago that Fairtrade was founded. And I'm a policy and advocacy officer in Fairtrade Netherlands, which is the Dutch market organization of the whole Fairtrade worldwide system. So we get up every day to try to make sure that Fairtrade coffee is promoted in our markets, but also other commodities such as cocoa, banana, to ensure that the people who make those products, because, well, the majority of the food that we consume is produced by smallholder farmers or producers, and that they get a fair chance of decent living. So that's what we do.
Beautiful. I mean, and it's such a difference that it can make, isn't it? Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what you see are the real benefits that arise from working in this way so closely with the producers and the farmers. What difference does it make to their lives and to their security?
Yeah, well, the differences can be huge because unfortunately coffee farmers, but also farmers from other crops, they are subject to many challenges. So for example, climate change is affecting their livelihoods, is affecting their communities and their crops and their produce on a daily basis. So weather patterns are of course changing. The coffee market is a highly volatile market. So the coffee prices fluctuate extremely, which means that producers don't know what to count on for the coming months or years or periods to come. So they have little security in their investments and in their income. They often live in poverty or extreme poverty even. And we're really talking about 125 million people depending on coffee and producing coffee in total. So that's just a huge number. And Fairtrade tries to improve their situation. We are working with standards, which include the Fairtrade minimum price and premium, that ensures that they at least receive the cost of sustainable production and have a premium that they can invest in their communities, in their crops, in their farm, to ensure that they continue to develop themselves in a more sustainable way. So that really can be a game changer, but we need everyone to step up and participate in that because we can't do it alone, of course.
No, absolutely. And actually, it's so interesting that in fact, just your model actually of engaging and understanding what farmers really need, that create the standards, you set a minimum price based on what you see is really needed. And actually, I should mention to everyone listening, we've just formed a wonderful partnership with Fairtrade International and B-Lab. And as you know, both of us are really interested in the standards of what is a really good standard of for a company to operate in, or for impact to really be certainly generated. So we have this area in common, as well as I think an advocacy agenda that we're increasingly involved in. But just tell us a little bit about how you would set those standards. So how you decide that this is the right point to settle on.
Yeah, well, it's very important to do that together. So I think Fairtrade is really built on the consensus that everyone needs to be involved, most of all the producers that produce this food, because they know what they need and they know what's important for them. And I always say it's not up to us in our office in Utrecht, for example, or in Amsterdam to decide what's best for them. They can decide that perfectly themselves. So the whole Fairtrade system is built on stakeholder inclusion. And we're talking about stakeholder governance, of course, today. And I think Fairtrade is really built on that premises. So in the Fairtrade General Assembly, the producers hold 50% of the vote, which means that everything that we do, there's a general vote and producers are included with 50% on that. But also in the standard setting process, producers are highly involved. So they co-determine together with other stakeholders in their supply chain what is needed for updates, for example, on the standards, and what requirements can be added or maybe have to be deleted or upgraded. So that's really, it's really important to not impose any sustainability activities on producers, because they need to be in the driver's seat. And I think that's really what Fairtrade is all about, putting farmers and workers in the front and center of everything that we do. So that makes it really amazing to work here as well. Yeah.
It must do, because it also changes the power balance hugely, doesn't it? It really tries to reflect back the power to those whose crops are actually the ones that we're all interested in buying and benefiting from. So it's a really important sort of shift. And presumably that means you or members of your team go out to coffee producers and spend time with them and understand.
Yeah, definitely. And the importance, of course, is so it's not like we are traveling all the time and jumping on planes, because that's not what we need to do, given climate change, of course. But the amazing thing about Fairtrade is that we have local Fairtrade producer organizations in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia, which means that so our local offices, they know the producers, they know the organizations in the area, and they are the ones mainly traveling to the farming communities, giving trainings or capacity building sessions or awareness raising sessions on certain areas. And that's really an important thing. So, and I think that makes Fairtrade unique in the sense that there's no other certification scheme that is so locally rooted within those communities as we are. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And actually, while we're talking about stakeholder governance, I think even within Fairtrade itself, you have your own model of stakeholder governance. Maybe it'd be interesting just to hear a little bit about that, if you didn't mind sharing.
Yeah, so for us, the most important pillar of that, and that's also what we include, of course, in our advocacy efforts, is that we believe that everything that you do should be done together. So the farming communities are represented in 3 producer networks, yes, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia, with local offices over there, and they hold 50% of our General Assembly.
Yes.
And that's also why we advocate always for a bottom-up and inclusive approach for businesses. So we really know what it means to have like farmer representatives in your board of directors. So that's something, of course, that must resonate with you as well as BLAB. As long as you don't have an inclusive board of directors or inclusive management, how inclusive will your policies be? So I think that's something that we all can learn from, and it needs to be improved always because times change, and you need to be on top of it to make sure that we don't settle. That's not something that we should do.
Yeah, it's very interesting that one of the things that's come out, I think, through some of these conversations is that there's no fixed way, no one way of actually bringing what we would call stakeholder governance, i.e. the voice of everybody who's affected by a business's decisions into the governance structure. Some people do it through representation, some people do it through all sorts of assemblies, some people do it through much closer dialogue ongoing. Yes, some people do it through, there's a variety of different ways. And I think the one thing that we're learning from this is that underneath this very sort of broad hood of sustainable corporate governance, which is, you know, the big topic that the European Union are really looking at, I think there is plenty of scope to learn and find out which ways work best and to evolve them as we go. But I think probably what frightens people is this idea that, right, that means it has to be done this way. There has to be a representative in the room on every decision from every single person who might be affected. And clearly that becomes a rather sort of cumbersome and not necessarily the best way always of taking these decisions. So exploring different models, finding out what else works, looking at different things through voting, through AGMs and through continuous dialogue feels really critical.
And combining those instruments, I think, is really important. There's not one silver bullet towards stakeholder governance and inclusion and bottom-up implementation, but if you combine all those efforts and ensure that on various levels in your organization, you have representation, but also extensive stakeholder dialogue.
Yes.
If you have a continuous circle of stakeholder dialogue and including and really listening and engaging with, for example, farmer communities or representatives or NGOs, businesses, experts, then the chance that you have most views involved is really high. And I think that you can start with that tomorrow, because it doesn't have to be all fixed from the starting point. You can learn by doing, and you get to know more people and more organizations, and they just keep the ball rolling.
Keep the ball rolling, exactly. Yeah. And I think another area that sometimes concerns, say, directors of companies is how do I then balance all those interests? Because if I'm running a company which has got, you know, maybe producer interest, but it's also got sort of distributor interest, and it maybe have consumer interest, how do we put all these together and decide which stakeholder has a different vote over others? And I mean, I'm sure that's something that plays out every day in businesses. But it's something you probably have seen.
And I think that all starts with understanding what happens in your supply chain, in the supply chain that you're active in. So, for example, when it comes to human rights and environmental rights, you really need to understand, and people can explain it to you. You don't have to figure it out all on your own, of course, because it's difficult sometimes, and human rights are very complex, and the contextual factors are intense. So it starts by understanding what are the root causes, for example, of human rights violations at the beginning of supply chains, and that's what Fairtrade brings in concrete instruments for, because since poverty is a root cause for many human rights violations, so as long as people are poor, really poor, it will be very difficult for them to put their children into school or feed them properly or make sure that they have decent living conditions. So addressing those root causes first will create an enabling effect for all the other human rights issues. So it's really about understanding what's going on in that supply chain. how am I related to that? What are my purchasing practices contributing to? I need to be paying decent prices, fairer prices to ensure that farmers can live a living income, and all those things combined. And then you get the ball rolling. And then from that starting point, from that living income or living wages, you can build further in, for example, increasing productivity or education or health and everything. But it starts with addressing those root causes, because otherwise it's just
you don't understand you really got to get into the understanding of what are the issues there. Absolutely. And I know this is something that many of our B Corps are also interested in. In fact, here's a kind of a teaser for the chat box, but for any of you who'd like to just give a guess of, or maybe you know, how many B Corps there are that are Fairtrade certified as well. Do put your guesses into the chat, and we can reveal the number in a short time. But yes, just coming back to human rights, and one of the issues that the EU are looking at very clearly under the Sustainable Corporate Governance Directive is the human rights, really through due diligence. What are the due diligence considerations that should be in place? And I think there's a very wide recognition of the kind of the human rights elements of due diligence, but presumably the kind of perhaps the battleground is to extend that into many more other human rights issues that are at stake here, as people are facing poverty and really vulnerable lives through climate change. So I would imagine that what Fairtrade will feel also is that this extension of what we think of as due diligence, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but assuming that this due diligence opportunity to expand that is a really big part. And I know in the Dutch marketplace you've been very active there too. Yeah. Maybe you could just say a little bit about that.
So no, but it all comes down with how any due diligence legislation is implemented in the end, of course. So for me, advocating with many other NGOs and civil society organizations, but also Fairtrade and B Corp certified businesses joined our coalition in the Netherlands to advocate for legislation, because we believe that national legislation can also be like a vehicle for European legislation to raise the bar on that level. And that is necessary because legislation in itself, or a duty of care in itself, is not a silver bullet. It all depends on how the legislation is set up and if it really touches upon those sensitivities in those supply chains. So if it's just a compliance criteria legislative bill, or if it's just a tick the box exercise for businesses that they don't have to go beyond tier 1, for example, whereas the majority of the issues often in supply chains are at the beginning of supply chains. Well, what does a coffee farmer benefit from that in the end? So everything that we do is, for example, when reading those legislative proposals and when engaging with organizations, that is, okay, how does this bill or directive influence, for example, the chances of living incomes and living wages for producers at the beginning of supply chains? Because as long as that legislation doesn't touch upon unfair trading practices and doesn't explicitly reference that living incomes, but also the right to unionize are enabling rights, then in the end, will it be the instrument that we need? So it's extremely important to have these legislative proposals there, and I really hope that they will come true, because we need a level playing field, and we've seen that voluntary instruments alone will not fix it. That's just the way it is. But it all depends on how the legislation is set up and if it addresses those root causes of violations, because otherwise we're not there yet.
We're not there yet. No, absolutely. No. And this is.
But it's an important step. I want to be a bit positive as well, because
I. Definitely. No, I think you're absolutely right. And actually just listening and responding to people in the chat. Yes, well, a nice range of guesses there. Actually, we are, in fact, at the moment, 200 B Corps are also Fairtrade licensed. So for those B Corps that are operating in the commodities that Fairtrade work with, which is especially bananas, coffee, some cashew nuts, maybe others that you would say are that your key products, let's lift that. Let's get this number up, because that's a really important way of just absolutely living the values of what a B Corp is doing, is to actually think of their suppliers and producers as the core components and core contributors to what the business is doing. So so it's interesting the range of numbers that we might get to, but so far this is a really exciting dual kind of sort of certification and recognition of work that's been going on in these companies. Yeah, I think just picking back up on your point about kind of what can the legislation do? I mean, just for everybody who's on the call, you know, I mean, I can't stress enough how exciting it was to read the European Union's sort of consultation. They're not usually the most exciting documents to read, but this one read like someone in the Commission had really got hold of this idea that we could change the way business works. And actually, we could make it mandatory for every business to have to think about and take decisions on the basis of all the people who are affected, including the future generations, potentially. I mean, this is sort of really, I mean, it seemed to go in a huge leap forward from where we've been in the past. So this opportunity now, and I think 1,000 or more contributors to that consultation responded with a range of different contributions around what the due diligence requirements should be, what the duty of care kind of should be for all the stakeholders. And now we're waiting. We're in this kind of waiting game because it's clearly giving the Commission quite a lot of thought. And in fact, they have, I think, now started to bring in the commissioner that's most responsible for competition. And one of the things I think that's going to get played out is, to what extent does this hinder competition or hinder competitiveness of the company? And I think probably both Fairtrade and BLab would say, actually, it's a promoter of, and maybe you would like to give some thoughts on that too.
So it basically resolves the problem a bit to have, via having a level playing field, the competition issue. Well, of course, I'm not an expert on that, and there are probably many people thinking very hard on this in Brussels, but because you have a level playing field and because everyone needs to address to the same rules, and giving that due diligence gives room for proportionality, I think it shouldn't be an argument. But hey, that's me.
Yeah, well, that's right, and that's why we really encourage any of you listening on the line who are attached to businesses or are thinking about how you can make a difference to this discussion, please do look up all the work that Fairtrade is doing, and we'll be putting a link in the chat to that as well. And also have a look at our site on the Interdependence Coalition, which is really a twofold site. It's trying to demystify or bust the myths that go around stakeholder governance, and also to encourage people to join this advocacy, so that the EU really does seize this opportunity. You know, we see COP potentially, well, it's got a lot of work to do in 2 weeks, and then at the actual session, and you know, there is a risk that COP won't quite get to where we need it to get to, and it will put even more pressure on big, you know, global bodies to find the way of creating the regulatory framework for this to happen. So if you are at all interested in being part of this work and discussion, please, yes, and Maria, thank you for putting that in the chat. That's super. And there are a few questions I think that we could answer from the chat, if that's right. Hester, there's one here from Bernard, and he is asking here, what are the big social topics on the horizon for Fairtrade's producer or smallholder standards? I don't know if you'd be able to answer to that.
So if in general, of course, the standards are revised per certain time frames through extensive stakeholder consultation. And for example, now we've just had a coffee standard update, which included due diligence requirements, but also more environmental requirements. So it's always a balance between social and environmental on the producer level, and addressing those risks and root causes. So enabling the Fairtrade cooperatives, for example, on performing risk analysis to in line with due diligence requirements. And that's ongoing as well for cocoa. There's a consultation coming up, and then maybe other standards will be revised in the next years as well. So.
Yeah, super. This issue of standards that are kind of evolving all the time, it's quite a, you know, you have to keep up, don't you? It's quite a business of standards setting organizations. There's the pace of, and maybe leading actually on to another question that Saskia asked is about the pace of civic expectations. So she's asking, Saskia asked, you know, what successes, trends or challenges have you seen in consumer awareness of fair trade as a certification in the last few years? I think in general in the Netherlands at least, consumer awareness is rising
high on various levels. So we see people speaking up to our government on addressing climate change. We see people eating less meat, buying more fair trade products every year. So it's rising every year. We're doing independent analysis of that, of course. And I think it all adds up because we need consumers, organizations, businesses, and our governments together to inform those new supply chains and make sure that human rights are for everyone. So we all have a role to play, and I think it's amazing to see that consumers are picking up that role even more than they used to. So that's great. Yeah.
Absolutely. Excellent. And maybe just in our last minute or so, as I'm afraid we have a hard stop at 10 o'clock for European time, just a call to action for people that you really want to be involved in this. You see, yes, Maria, the petition, Maria has posted the petition for fair trade, a call for a fair climate. This could not be more topical, as I say, 2 weeks from COP. Please do sign that if you feel you can support this in really important work. Do join the Interdependence Coalition, that also is in the chat. But also just please do open up conversations with your teams, with your friends. It doesn't need to be a really sort of nerdy topic. It's really about our future and our children's future and our grandchildren. So please do open up these conversations and let's explore, because I don't think there are perfect answers already on the shelf. What we're finding is we're learning, we're evolving all the time on what does it really look to mean to run a company or businesses generally in the interests of everyone who contributes to it. It seems so simple, and yet it is tricky to do. So we would really love to have you join our sort of efforts to unpack this, and our advocacy to ask for this to be the absolutely only way in which businesses operate. And let's see this agenda move in a leapfrog forward, which would be fantastic. So a huge thank you to you all, and particularly to you, Hester. It's a total delight to speak to you. And thank you so much for just sharing really rich information, and we're delighted to be in this partnership with you, with B-Lab generally and Fairtrade International, and this is just the kickoff as we work through together with other factors that we have in common. So thank you again, and to all of you on the chat, have a good day and enjoy your coffee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie, for having me.
A pleasure.